Thank you, comrades. I should just say I was lucky enough to sit through large bits of John's trial for reporting for it for Socialist Worker. I've never really believed in British justice. If anyone was ever guilty of inciting a riot, he certainly was. But perhaps more importantly on the question of justice, I want to have a big welcome to the comrades from the Hillsborough Justice Campaign who are here tonight. One of Thatcher's most disgusting elements was the demonising of the 96 who were killed by the cops at Hillsborough. And I hope the comrade will speak later on, because it's an important part of remembering precisely how brutal Thatcher was. Amongst the tsunami of guff that surrounded Operation True Blue today, that's what they called it, wasn't it, the burying of Thatcher? No politics involved, by the way. Just chance that it was called Operation True Blue. It could have been Operation Deep Red. Anything could have been, but it happened to be True Blue. I was very pleased to get a press release from the Press Association this afternoon that said the following. Some former miners reacted to the pageantry in London by parading an effigy of Baroness Thatcher in a noose and planned to bury a coffin later. Residents of Goldthorpe, South Yorkshire, were preparing to pull a replica of a coffin through the streets before setting it ablaze. An effigy of the late Tory leader has been strung up in a noose outside the social club, with signs reading Thatcher Milk Snatcher and Thatcher the Scab. One home in the town displayed a huge sign saying, "The lady's not for turning, but tonight she'll be for burning." This all appears in the papers, my brother. Residents stopped to take photos of the pub, which was decked out with bunting and banners that said, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, Thatcher's Britain has gone bust." Around Grindthorpe, former miners had put up a range of banners. On the old pit winding wheel at the northern entrance to the village, one banner said, "Thatcher died naturally, but she murdered our pit." And on another, "No tears for Thatcher," outside the Working Men's Club, one banner said, "At last." At bloody last. That sense, that brutal rule that Thatcher represented, it's not over, it's not finished, we know that. Capitalism goes on, the attacks go on, but at least that symbol of what Thatcher has done was removed when we heard that she had died. And we've learned quite a lot, haven't we, over the last few days since her death. Firstly, we've learned that you're not allowed to speak ill of the dead, are you? They can do the most appalling things in their lives, but oh no, at this time she's merely a mother and grandmother. That's what it was about today, a small private funeral that was held in London. Terrible to speak ill of the dead. Not they follow it themselves. I looked at the Daily Mail after Michael Foot died. Michael Foot was not a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, he was the leader of the Labour Party. But their headline, Richard Littlejohn, still works in the Mail, hounded Lucy Meadows to a death recently. His headline on Foot the day after, "Good old Footy, now a dangerous deluded hypocrite." Hardly a holding back on the idea of personal abuse about anybody. I was on a radio programme. There's so much news in the world now that you can hardly walk in the streets of London at the moment with someone asking you to give an interview to Swiss television or somebody. They asked me to speak about it, and they said, "It's disgraceful, isn't it, to protest at a funeral?" I said, "Well, come on. It's a political stunt, but more than that, let's remember it was Thatcher who instructed the Social Security to cut off money to miners for funerals during the strike. One of the most brutal things they did, cutting off Social Security to try and force people back to work. What a disgraceful political point, he said, to raise that issue at this time. We're not allowed to say any of these. We have to tell the truth about it. The truth is, she was a brutal class warrior who fought with everything in their power to grind down our class, to jack up profits to the other side. That's what it's about. Knock out all the fripperies. And she wasn't just attacking people in Britain. She played a role across the world as well. The friend of apartheid, the friend of Pinochet in Chile, the woman who sent 10 people to their deaths in the H block in Northern Ireland rather than grant them political status because they were Republicans, the woman who unleashed the Falklands War, 900 death, Argentinian and British, in order to save her own face and to try and win an election. That's the truth about what Thatcher represented. Let's have none of this guff about she saved Britain. The only thing that she should be remembered is she fought hard for the ruling class, and regrettably our side let her achieve victories she shouldn't have been allowed to achieve. She came to office instructed to follow up the policies that had already begun in 1975 and 1976 under Dennis Healey and James Callaghan under the Labour government. You know what happened? If you look at British history, the biggest rise in workers' living standards, 1970 to 1974, when workers fought, threatened a general strike, big action by miners and other groups of workers. One of the biggest falls in workers' living standards towards the end of that Labour government, 76 to 79. And they still had not got enough. They had to push up the rate of profit. It was falling because of the crisis of the 1970s. Smaller crisis than now, but a real crisis, nonetheless. And they were determined that British capitalism was going to survive. They didn't just need a softie, like the Labour government, they needed someone much harder than that. And that's what Thatcher came into office to do. And it was a difficult job. It wasn't that our side rolled over. We had a tradition, an organisation. The miners had won in 1972 and 1974. Even in 78, 79, just before Thatcher came to office, the winter of discontent, workers had shown they were still capable of fighting in a very hard way against the other side. So Thatcher found it difficult. John's right. 1981, when the miners went on strike, led by South Wales, Thatcher backed off because they knew they were going to lose. In 1983, Thatcher was at 23% in the polls. That's how bloody popular she was amongst the British population. 23% her personal rating was after the riots in the cities, after the miners' victory in 81, after people seeing what Thatcher was doing. And it was only because of the split, the SDP, the right wing of the Labour Party, and the use of the Falklands War, Thatcher came back in 84, 85 and was then allowed to win the miners' strike. The miners' strike was absolutely critical. That's why Norman is such an important speaker tonight. And our side should have won. If the miners hadn't been left on their own, our side would have won. Could have won when the dockers were on strike, when the rail workers were moving towards a strike, when the pit supervisors, NACODs, were on the verge of going on strike. Our side could have won, and the history of Britain and of the world would be different if the miners had won. If we'd kept that trade union and working class strength, many of the assaults that have been carried out on working class people would not have been possible in the subsequent years. You know what Thatcher did achieve? When she came to office, 60% of GDP went to wages. By the time she left, 50% of GDP went to wages. Doesn't sound very much, does it? It's a vast sucking of wealth towards the powerful people and the rich people at the top. The vast increase in inequality as well. If we still had 60% of GDP going to wages, the average worker in Britain would be £160 a week better off today. That 160 quid a week better off for the average worker in Britain. That's what Thatcher and those who came afterwards managed to push through. Two other points I want to make. One is that she lost in the end. And it's very important to remember, for all this Iron Lady stuff, when our class fought together around the poll tax, we were capable of defeating her. She wasn't allowed into a quiet retirement. She was shuffled off by a desperate party who knew they had a loser on their hands unless they got rid of her. Because our side had organised. And let's remember that. All this stuff about the working class is weak, in our communities we can't organise, the other side is so strong. Of course they're strong. Of course they're capable of extreme ruthlessness. That's another thing that Thatcher did. Militarising the police, using every means to take away our rights and to take away our capacity to fight back against people and our power to protest. That Thatcher did as well, and they are strong, and they are brutal, and they are ruthless. But come on, this is no time for pessimism. We have to be realistic, we have to recognise the problems, but we have to start from the understanding that when our class moves together, we can defeat the other side, we can defeat apartheid, we can defeat Thatcher, and we can defeat Cameron and his cronies again today. And that's the important point, you see, because this meeting isn't a history lesson. It's not just looking back, but it's inspiring to look back and remember the brutality of Thatcher and also the potential of our side to fight and to win. This is a meeting about today, because in truth what followed Thatcher was worse than Thatcher. New Labour continued it. Did you see that quote from Blair about Thatcher? That's one of the things we learnt this week, wasn't it? Oh, how terrible that Mrs. Thatcher has died. We all admired her. She was a conviction politician. I mean, for goodness sake, what was Blair's quote? I saw my job as building on the things she had done rather than reversing them. Indeed he did, didn't he? A turbocharged version of inequality under New Labour. And now under Cameron we're seeing them going much further. Privatisation much further. The attack on benefits much further. And we have to be determined to fight back and also to remember the lessons of the 1980s. That we can't rely on the trade union leaders and we can't rely on the Labour Party to do it for us. See, there's an interesting election last week inside Unite, one of the biggest trade unions in Britain, which showed a bit of a sense of a mood, I think, amongst working people in Britain. Jerry Hicks, who was a left-wing candidate, stood against Len McCluskey. You know Len McCluskey, he's a left-wing trade union leader, on the left as trade union leaders go. Someone who makes very powerful speeches about the rottenness of the coalition and the need to do things and so on. He doesn't organise very much. That's the difficulty. The gap is there. Between his words are very, very militant, the action is very negligible. So there was a left-wing candidate against him. People said, oh, he won't get any votes. He'll be humiliated. He'll be wiped out. The Socialist Workers' Party, you're the only people on the left who support him. He's not serious at all. How many votes did he get? 80,000 votes he got. 36% of the votes. 36% of the vote. Not bad, eh? Not bad for someone who was negligible, someone who didn't deserve support. And if there's that mood inside the Unite Union, it exists everywhere. In every factory, in every bus garage, in every construction site, in every workplace in Britain, there are people who are bitter that the Tories are getting away with murder and our side isn't fighting hard enough back against it. And our job, just as it was in the 1980s, is to organise those people in the factories, in the workplaces, but also in the communities. John's right about the bedroom tax and against the attacks on benefits, and also to take on the bitter scapegoating lies against immigrants that are being used by every political force to try and divide us. We learned from the 1980s the danger of division, and one of the key ways they're trying to divide us across the world now is to set black against white, immigrant against native worker. We can't allow it to happen. We have to organise to fight. We also need to organise to unite. And the final point is this. We also need a political organisation at the centre of this. We need to have pulling together the different forms of struggle against austerity, fighting for women's liberation, fighting against racism, fighting against the Nazis, but also fighting for an end to the system that Thatcher defended. Because the problem in the end is not about one or two people, one or two individuals. It's about a system of capitalism that produces crisis, poverty and war. And what we should really learn from Thatcher's life and the legacy is the determination to make sure that in that fight we're going to build the sort of organisation that can help secure a a socialist future and for people before profit. That's why I hope you'll join the Socialist Workers' Party.